by the Society of Antiquaries of London. My name is Brian Ayres. I have the honour of being the Honorary Secretary of the Society. But I also have the very great privilege today of introducing today's speaker. I was until recently the county archaeologist in Norfolk, and I've therefore known Matt Champion for a considerable period of time. And what Matt has managed to do in the last few years is almost to invent, I would have to say, a form of archaeological investigation. It really is quite remarkable. It's a very great privilege for us to have him here to speak today. He promises to speak for some 40 to 45 minutes, and then there will be time for questions, so that we can aim to finish about 2 o'clock for those of you who have to rush off to things which I suspect will be marginally less exciting. I do hope you enjoy this talk, and I very much look forward to hearing it. Matt, thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's now official. We are making it up, apparently. So thank you for that, Brian. As you've heard, my name is Matt Champion. I have the honour to be the project director for the Norfolk Medieval Graffiti Survey. I'm also supposedly one of England's leading experts on early graffiti inscriptions, although, as I pointed out to my mother, it's not difficult to be the leading expert when you're the only one studying it. First of all, a little bit about the graffiti survey itself. The project has now just entered its, its 4th year. It is an entirely volunteer-led community archaeology project. What that means in essence is none of us get paid. It's all undertaken by wonderful volunteers, most of whom have no previous archaeological experience whatsoever. We follow basic recording techniques using what we call raking light. So many of the graffiti inscriptions that you'll see today, we have reworked these images so they are easier to be seen on screen. When you actually see them in the flesh, often you'll walk past them without even noticing them. It's only when we use particular lighting conditions that they appear. And that is literally running the light very obliquely across the surface, and then you suddenly, as if by magic, the image will appear. And many of those inscriptions are only visible for as long as it takes to take a photograph. After that, lights go off and they go back into the darkness, as it were. The project itself, well, we started in Norfolk. And the reason we started in Norfolk, many people would like to tell you, it's because the county has more medieval churches surviving than any other county in England. 650 plus medieval churches in one county. The real reason, though, is because I lived there. So it was probably the wrong place to start, really. However, to date, we have now surveyed over 270 churches in Norfolk. We've expanded out into Suffolk, where we've done well over 70 churches in Suffolk, and we now have new surveys taking place in Lincolnshire, East Sussex, and Surrey. So let us move on and look at some graffiti. First of all, usually gets a giggle this slide. First of all, these days, if you read a newspaper article or a magazine story, and it has the term church and graffiti in the same story, the connotations aren't going to be good. Graffiti today is seen as something that's destructive. It's seen as something that's antisocial. It's not something you'd really welcome on a church building. However, that simply wasn't the case in the Middle Ages. Of the 250 plus churches we've already surveyed in Norfolk, we've discovered graffiti inscriptions in over 60% of them. Of those graffiti inscriptions, over 50% of those all appear to be devotional in nature. This is not something that is a Joe Bloggs was here type thing. Many of these inscriptions are actually part of what we would think of as lay piety within the medieval church. So many of these are quite literally prayers written in stone. Now, why is it important to study this graffiti? Well, if you believe Brian Ayres, we've just made it up as a new area of study, something to keep a few archaeologists busy. However, I started life as a social historian. So the wonderful thing about these graffiti inscriptions is they can shed new light on many of the ways in which ordinary people interacted with their church. If you walk into any medieval church, just about anywhere in the country, just about everything you see, the stained glass, the alabaster monuments, the brasses on the floor, all of those relate to the elite. They relate to the top 5 or 10% of society. Those who could afford to have themselves memorialised and commemorated in those buildings. Where then is the other 90%? Where are the real people, the common people, the people who helped build that church, the people who lived and worshipped there? Where is their testament? Well, occasionally we find record of them in the odd document, in manor court rolls, wills, things of that nature. But those documents tend to reflect times when those individuals interacted with authority. So they're really kind of atypical moments in their lives. They don't reflect those individuals' everyday interactions with the church, and they certainly don't give any hint as to their nature of belief. So the wonderful thing about the graffiti inscriptions is they have the potential, and I stress that, potential, to have been created by all levels of society. And they have the potential to tell us a lot more about how those individuals interacted with their church as both an institution and a building. So, what are we finding? Well, we'll start with the boring stuff first, shall we? Most of the graffiti we find is exactly the same. Whichever church you go into, in Norfolk, Sussex, Northumberland, even in France and Spain, the chances are you will come across the same markings. These probably make up, and I couldn't give you exact numbers on this because we're already dealing with over 12,000 inscriptions just in Norfolk alone, but these make up a significant proportion of all the inscriptions we come across. Now, these 4 symbols you see before you, when we began the project, we believed these were the 4 principal symbols that you would find within medieval churches. The one on the top left, the compass-drawn design, or the daisy wheel as it's more commonly known, this particular design turns up all over the place. It's a fantastic little symbol in the fact that it appears on just about every church building we've ever come across. I can't think offhand of a single church where we don't have some form of compass-drawn design. If there's graffiti there, there will be compass-drawn designs. The one to the right of it is known as the swastika pelter. It's been studied over the years by various archaeologists such as Sir Mortimer Wheeler, who gave it the term, the name. When we began the survey, we were led to believe this was a very, very common graffiti symbol. In fact, it's the reason we kind of chose it for the logo for the Norfolk Medieval Graffiti Survey. It was published by a lady called Violet Pritchard, who wrote the only full-length work on medieval graffiti back in 1967, English medieval graffiti, recently reprinted. In her publication, she stated that she'd found this in lots of East Anglian churches. However, when we started looking, and when we started looking wider than Violet Pritchard's rather sort of limited survey, we discovered that Violet had done something that no other person could do. She had picked about the only 14 churches in which this symbol appeared. We have since only found 2 other examples, both of which are in, or 2 other complete examples, both of which are in Norwich Cathedral, believe it or not. So Violet kind of struck lucky, and it was probably just the wrong symbol to choose as the logo. The other symbols you see before you, I'll go into those in a little more detail later, but suffice it to say that someone finding crosses on a church, we're not going to be terribly surprised about that. What we are surprised about is where we're finding them, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, these symbols are known as Apotropaic symbols. They are commonly believed to be, at the most basic level, they ward off evil. At the most fundamental level, they're good luck, but they protect a building. You find them in a post-medieval context going all the way through to the 18th century, particularly on vernacular buildings. In vernacular buildings in the 17th and 18th century, well, even back to the 16th, you find them around entranceways, thresholds, fireplaces. So you'll often go into an old Tudor building, and if you look at the fireplace or the Bessemer, you'll notice these compass-drawn designs and these VV markings on there. Now, when we began the survey, we also expected to find these in a similar situation. We expected to find them around thresholds, doorways, that sort of thing. Simply isn't the case. We're finding them in a much wider spread throughout a building. and we'll look at why that is a little later. Now, what I wanted to do first of all is look at one of these symbols in a little more detail, compass drawn designs. And you can see we have a fairly good selection in front of you. They vary from the very, very basic down here to a simple compass drawn circle, up to some very quite ornate examples, such as this one, which is actually Norwich Castle, and all the way through to some really, really quite complex multiple compass drawn designs as well. Now, these symbols have been studied for a while, and there are three main theories over the years that have developed as to what they actually mean. The first theory was really developed in the early 20th century by a Cambridge-based archaeologist by the name of Donald Atkinson. And he put forward the theory that these were all associated with the sites of consecration crosses within churches. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, consecration crosses mark the sites within a church, the 12 traditional sites, which would be marked and anointed with holy oil when that church was consecrated. Often you will see them still, large painted crosses in churches today, which still mark those sites. Now, Atkinson suggested that these compass-drawn designs all related to the sites of consecration crosses. Now, having looked at so many churches, I'm afraid we've been able to put aside that theory, as it were. Atkinson's idea of the consecration crosses, well, in certain churches, we're just finding too many of them. We're finding them spread all over the place. We're finding concentrations, so that one area within a church, if we look at somewhere like Swannington, will have about 20 of these all in one area of the church and none anywhere else in the church. So while some of these perhaps are associated with sites of consecration crosses, it certainly doesn't account for the majority of them. The second theory is perhaps more interesting, and it's still really, there's quite a few archaeologists and architectural historians who believe that this may well be the case. They put forward the idea that all these compass-drawn designs are the work of medieval masons, those people who are actually building the church itself. Because this simple compass-drawn design has within it the ability to teach their apprentices all the basics of Euclidean geometry. And you see in front of you here a very, very quick summary of exactly what you can do with a simple daisy wheel. First of all, you draw your compass-drawn circle, and then you move the compass point to the outside and you draw your arc. You move the point of your compass around to where that arc intersects the outside, you draw another arc. Eventually, a few strokes later, you have a nice daisy wheel, as you have on the top left. If you then join up all the points, you end up with a perfect hexagon. If you join up every second point, you end up with a perfect triangle. If you then join up the other 3 points, you have another hexagon inside, a perfect scaled hexagon, in fact. Join the 4 points, you have a rectangle. Divide that rectangle, you have a perfect right angle triangle. Take 4 points, or 3 of the outside points and 1 of the centre points, and you have a perfect diamond. From that simple compass-drawn circle, you have all the very basic geometric knowledge you need to build a cathedral. So you can see why this is very, very attractive as far as masonry is concerned. However, I'm afraid to say that 250 churches on, we can't agree with the masons either. Yes, it is likely that some of these are produced by masons. However, most of these that we're finding are tiny. They're 2 or 3 inches across. That tends to be the average size. Whereas masons are known for using their large-scale compasses. None of these we have found have been big daisy wheels, at least not in East Anglia. And so the chances are that these are done with a much, much smaller set of compasses. It's still possible it's masons. However, when we go into a church and we come across 20 or 30 of these compass-drawn designs, it does rather beg a few questions. In the first instance, there are other symbols that can be used to teach Euclidean geometry. Other symbols that we know are used by medieval masons because they turn up in manuscripts used by masons. We don't find those on the walls. We just find these. And the second point, really, I suppose, is the sheer quantity. As I say, if you can walk into a church and find 20, 30, 40 of these in some cases, then we either have to say that there were a lot more masons operating in medieval East Anglia than we first thought, or we had some very stupid apprentices. So I'm afraid the masons idea really just isn't going to cut the mustard for everything. It's not going to be able to explain all of these. So we're left with the third interpretation, that these are what we call apotropaic images. They are ritual protection marks. Now, as you can see from the examples in front of you, they turn up all over the place. We have North Norfolk coast, right up on the North Norfolk coast at Wiverton, we have a beautiful example set on one of the aisle pillars. At Troston, just over the border into Suffolk, or Greater Norfolk as we like to call it, we have a particularly interesting example. Troston is absolutely covered in graffiti. The Tower Arch has hundreds of inscriptions on it. The Chancel Arch also has hundreds of inscriptions on it as well. However, interestingly and unusually, all those inscriptions are on the chancel side of the chancel arch. That's quite unusual. Most of our graffiti we find is in the nave or in the tower. Finding it in the chancel is quite unusual. But at Troston, all of the graffiti on the chancel arch is on the chancel side, except if you move over to the nave side, there is one single daisy wheel at eye level on its own, and it's been respected by everything around it. Nowhere else on that chancel arch do compass-drawn designs appear. Just this one single daisy wheel. So it obviously has some form of significance. We also, looking further afield into the Norfolk Broads now, this rather wonderful example from Ludden. As you can see, we have a sort of a complex multiple daisy wheel here. Many of the examples we come across are very, very complex, where we have these multiple daisy wheels layered upon layer upon layer upon layer. I would first of all, bringing you back to the idea of the Masons, I would question exactly what this could teach anyone in terms of geometry beyond the basic compass-drawn circle. There is no reason for the rest of this design if it doesn't have some other ritual significance. It's also, this one may actually be supporting Atkinson's theory of some of these being associated with the site of consecration crosses, because there are two identical designs on opposite sides of the tower arch. No other compass-drawn designs. However, if we look at a place like Swannington, which has been one of our most recent discoveries, you start to see elements of what must really be quite a large ritual practice taking place during the Middle Ages. Swannington is full of graffiti, wonderful graffiti. There are images of weapons, there are people, there are Latin inscriptions, there are shields, just about everything you can possibly imagine. And there are a lot of compass-drawn designs. However, all those compass-drawn designs sit within one area of the church. And they sit on part of the tower and part of the north aisle. And they are all around one small area of this church. The rest of the church is covered in early graffiti, some are dating back to the 14th century, but it's only in this one area that we actually find all these compass-drawn designs. It also appears to be the one place where the font was originally located. So, looking in particular at Swannington, our theory at the moment is that all these compass-drawn designs are actually around the area where the font was located. Why would that be? Well, if we have to go back to the Old Testament for this, I suppose. If we are assuming that these have a ritual significance, and I'm afraid we are 4 years into the survey, then they have to have a function. And our theory at the moment is that these compass-drawn designs, these ritual protection marks, are acting as traps for demons, traps for evil spirits. And we haven't just gone off into Buffy the Vampire Slayer territory here. I will explain a bit further. This idea goes back, as I said, to the Old Testament, and it goes back to the story of Solomon. Those of you who know the Apocrypha in particular will know that Solomon was given a ring by one of the archangels. This ring had on it a design known as the Seal of Solomon, often seen as the 5-pointed pentacle or the 6-pointed Star of David. This ring gave Solomon the power over demons. Now, to take a second part of traditional folklore belief, and again something that turns up in a lot of East Anglian folklore, is something about demons. Demons, maybe it's only East Anglian ones, we're not sure about this, demons are quite stupid. Apparently, if they see a line, a demon has to follow it. And a demon will follow that line until it comes to an end. However, if a demon comes across a line that has no end, such as a daisy wheel or a circle, or even the seal of Solomon, the five-pointed star, then in effect that evil spirit, that demon, is trapped within that symbol. So the theory we've been working on at the moment, and it is only a theory, we may change our mind over the next 4 years, is that these are designed not just to ward off evil, but to actually trap those evil spirits within the symbol itself. So these are in effect demon traps. The fact that we're finding so many of them at places like Swannington, which are actually focusing on the area where the font used to be, suggests that this area of the church was deemed as needing extra protection. It was needed an enhanced spiritual protection. And if you think about a mother taking in an unbaptized infant into that church, then the period prior to baptism is when the soul of that child was most at risk, when this child's soul may actually need this additional protection. Now, Swannington is a very good example, but we have come across a number of other churches where we also have concentrations of these compass-drawn designs around the area where the font is. Now, I'm not suggesting this accounts for all of them, but it certainly does seem to be a very good working hypothesis at the moment, and it's certainly something we'll be looking at to see if the same pattern emerges over the next 400 churches. Other particular favourites of mine, well, this one has to be a favourite of mine, which don't quite fit the normal pattern. This one is from Edgefield up in North Norfolk, and as you can see, it's a basic daisy wheel, but it's been somewhat enhanced into this tri-lobe design. And we often get this where the daisy wheel itself has been enhanced and it's had additional elements added, often in multiples of 3. And the suggestion there is it's also drawing down the power of the Trinity. The Edgefield example is particularly wonderful, as Brian Ayres will tell you, in the fact that they moved the church in the 19th century. They actually took the church stone by stone and moved it about a mile away and rebuilt it on a new site closer to the growing new village, as it were. It also turns out they took the graffiti with them as well. In some cases, though, they obviously didn't follow the builder's plans quite as the original, because we found a couple of cases where we have half of an engraved design on one stone, and actually the block upon which it's engraved has been twisted round, so the other half is now around the corner. Perfect example of normal for Norfolk. He says moving into Suffolk. These particular examples are both from South Elm and St Margaret, just over on the Waverley Valley. And if you look at the example on the right here, it's one of the more complex designs that we've come across. You'll see, for starters, it's not a traditional daisy wheel. It doesn't follow the normal patterns. In fact, instead of having the 6 petals, it's got 8 petals. And also, to produce some of these outer curves, the compass point would actually have to be outside this circle. So rather than actually teaching someone the basics of geometry, the person who created these examples actually had to have a very good understanding of geometry before they were even started to create them. And when I say they turn up everywhere, I really mean they do turn up everywhere. This is the Thorpe Monument from Ashwellthorpe in Norfolk. It's one of the finest medieval alabaster monuments anywhere in the country. And as you can see, someone has put a rather lovely daisy wheel right on the side of his face. So when I say they turn up everywhere, we have thousands of examples. So many examples, in fact, that the latent archaeologist in me tried to develop a typology. You can't help it. You try and get order out of chaos, as it were. And as you can see, these don't represent all the designs we've come across, but they really represent some of the more typical designs that we come across. And if you start over here on the left with our basic circle and move across, as you can see, they develop into some very, very complex designs. Most of these are absolutely tiny. This particular example here is one from Norwich Cathedral, which is only 1.5 inches across. So absolutely tiny. Other symbols, moving away from compass drawn, other symbols we come across commonly, things like crosses. It's hardly surprising to anyone, I suppose, to find crosses inside a church. What is really interesting is where we're finding them. We don't find many crosses in the body of the church itself, within the nave, the chancel, or the tower. 90% of all the cross inscriptions we get are in the porch and around, in particular, the main doorway. In some cases, like Colkirk and like Ludden, over in the Broads again, we will find as many as a dozen or 24 of these crosses inscribed into the doorway. The tradition is that these are pilgrim crosses, that these are carved by the people going off on pilgrimage or pilgrims stopping there on the way to the way to a shrine. There's no real evidence, I'm afraid, to support that. There doesn't seem to be a concentration around places like Walsingham in North Norfolk or Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk. So the idea of them being associated with pilgrimage, there really isn't anything strongly to support that. We do suspect, though, they may be related to something else that's going on there. And in particular, what's going on in the porch itself. Today, a typical East Anglian church porch is kind of used for the notice board and the dog bowl. It's really not a main part of the church. However, during the Middle Ages, that simply wasn't the case. The porch itself was used for a lot more of the services. It was used as, in particular, in services such as the church in women and in the marriage service. Particularly the marriage service, where the first part of the service itself would actually take place at the church door. The porch was also used as a sort of de facto parish office. You'll often see in the big two-storey East Anglian porches that the area above the porch itself tends to become the parish office. Those who have smaller porches, the porch tends to be where people go to make agreements, to have documents signed, that sort of thing. And in particular, it may be to do with verbal contracts. So the suggestion at the moment, and it is only a suggestion, it does need further investigation, is that many of these crosses may in fact relate to agreements and documents being drawn up, or some other civil matter taking place within the parish, rather than having any distinct religious or ritual purpose. Another symbol that does keep turning up, much to the annoyance of church wardens and vicars in their churches, are the five-pointed star, the pentacle. When you get one of these in a church, it usually is that you point it out to the church warden, they do start getting a bit worried. Do we have devil worshippers turning up in the church? Well, I have an admission to make, I suppose, on these. When I first started the survey, looking at all these churches, I tended to ignore these. I came across them, but I ignored them. And it was only sort of a year later, when I sat down and I was reviewing all the images we've got so far, that I realised we actually had quite a number of these, and I hadn't really taken any notice of them. And I suppose it's really that I associated them myself with non-religious practice, with black magic. In particular, probably I'd spent too much time watching bad Hammer horror movies when I was younger. But these were turning up in significant numbers. Now the pentangle, of course, or the pentacle, long before it was ever associated with demons and black magic, was a Christian symbol. In fact, it's one of the few of these apotropaic images, these apotropaic symbols, that we actually have any written reference for. And if you go back to the 14th century poem of Gawain and the Green Knight, we actually have an entire page and a half dedicated to the symbolism of the pentacle. Gawain, as you know, was equipping himself to go off and fight the Green Knight, and he was given a shield. And it was a scarlet shield, and on that shield was a five-pointed golden star. On the back of the shield was an image of the Virgin Mary. And the author of Gawain and the Green Knight actually says in the text, he says, and at this point, I will, even though it will break the story, I will explain exactly about the symbolism of the five-pointed star, the pentacle. And he says it represents the five wounds of Christ. It represents the five virtues of the knight. It represents the five fingers and thumb of the hand. It gives him protection. And if we go back to this idea of this actually being the seal of Solomon, what we have here is really quite significant. So here we have the knight with his physical protection of the shield, which is being enhanced by the spiritual protection of the five-pointed star. So it's really, it's protecting him physically and spiritually. And the Virgin Mary on the rear of the shield is there for him to look upon and draw courage from and inspiration. So as I say, it's one of the symbols we do actually have a written reference for, which is very unusual. Now, what's particularly fascinating is when we went back and started looking at these images, we realised that we were coming across these in two particular ways. Now, I'd love to say it was me that came up with this theory, but it wasn't. It was a young student up at the University of Liverpool by the name of Becky Williams, and she called me and she said, Matt, I've been looking at all these 5-pointed stars, and I've noticed we keep coming across them in 2 particular ways. She said the first one is related to demons. Like this particularly wonderful example from Troston in Suffolk. I'm not sure if some people can't make this out, but here we have a big head of a demon with the eye up there, big mouth running around here, and a big tongue sticking out. And there, deeply engraved, inscribed right across the surface, is this 5-pointed star. And she said, well, the second place we keep coming across these, is in relation to people, images of human beings. So if we have an image of a person, and these 2 particularly good examples from Swannington and Troston, we see the same 5-pointed star, but instead of being over the top of the image, it's next to the image. It's either in front, above, below, or behind. It's never over the top. Now, Becky's theory was a simple one, and it's one we've been yet to disprove. This 5-pointed star is an Apotropaic symbol, a ritual protection mark, but it has a very distinct function. It is there to protect from demons. If it is found over the top of a demon, it is there trapping that demon. It is literally pinning it to the stonework. However, if it's seen next to an individual, next to a very human figure, then the idea is that this is actually seeking protection for those individuals from demons. As I said, it's a working theory that we've been yet to disprove. So it may well be we have real demon traps. Now, moving away from our Apotropaic stuff, some of the other bits and pieces we come across an awful lot of work that has actually been done by masons. Many of you will have probably heard of the tracing floors and the tracing houses at places like York Minster and Wells Cathedral, where the masons, when they're actually designing the cathedral themselves, they use a big area like this room and plaster floor, and they actually use it to trace out their designs on the floor. Well, what we found in Norfolk is that they don't just use floors. When tracing floors are in short supply, the masons actually use the walls. Most of the time these go unnoticed, and it's only when you start shining the lights across the surface you realise that in many cases some of the original designs for the church are still there, as it were, on the wall. This is one of 5 large-scale epurays, as they're known, which we discovered at Binham Priory up on the North Norfolk coast. This particular example is over 8 feet tall and appears to show parts of the design dating back from the 1240s of the revolutionary west front of the cathedral, priory rather. On exactly the opposite end of the spectrum, this example is only 140 millimetres across, about that big, and it's from one of the piers at Western Longford. It appears to show the design for, or the elements of a design for a tracery window. This was actually located about 3 metres up on one of the piers, and we know it was created in situ because those lines you see extending up to the top actually have their centre point on the stone above it. So this was actually the masons working out sketches and designs for window designs actually on the piers themselves, so working it out as they were going along. And it's not just the stonework. This particular example is on the back of the rood screen at Caston in Norfolk. And as you can see, it goes across, these are the boards that make up the rood screen itself, these vertical lines here. And this is where they've been designing the top of the rood screen on the back of the bottom section. Now, for many people who studied rood screens, one of the ideas were that most of these rood screens were fabricated elsewhere and then brought into the church in pieces and then erected literally on the spot, as it were. However, we've now come across a number of these designs on the back of rood screens, which suggest that maybe the bottom sections were fabricated elsewhere, but actually the top sections were all designed in situ. So literally they'd be turning the chancel or the nave into a workshop, using any flat surface they could as a drawing board. Most of these have gone completely unnoticed. So in some cases, as with Caston, the top of the rood screen has long gone. Probably disappeared in the 16th century, and no one knows what it looked like. Now we've got those original designs, we can actually reconstruct what the upper section of that rood screen looked like. Another particularly good example from Blythburgh on the back of the screen there. In this particular example, as you can see, they've literally been working it out from first principles. So this is an architect actually sitting down, working out how to do a very complex piece of geometric woodwork from very, very first principles. So it not only can tell us what the top of that roof screen looked like, it can also give us an indication of exactly how they use the design process. Other things we come across, well, text. We get quite a lot of text. These particularly good examples, the one on the top left is one of my favourites, in the fact it's one of the few inscriptions we come across that we can tie down to a particular individual. This Yohed Abthorpe, John Abthorpe, appears to have been Lord of the Manor of Troston in the late 15th century. He turns up as witness in a number of wills from the 1460s and 1470s. So as I say, it's one of the few we can tie down to a real individual person. Why he felt the need to inscribe his name on the tower arch, we're not quite so sure. The top right is a particularly intriguing example, one of 3 inscriptions from Wiverton, up on the North Norfolk coast again, which appear to be in archaic Greek. Now, what that says about the clergy in North Norfolk, I don't know. What we do have, though, is a story of Erasmus visiting the shrine of Walsingham, which is only a few miles away from Wiverton. And there, Erasmus hangs up a series of a prayer that he's written, and he's written it in Greek. The monks at Walsingham, though, are so ignorant of Greek that they believe it's written in Hebrew. However, a few miles away, someone, a friend of Erasmus perhaps, is inscribing the piers of Wiverton Church with Greek inscriptions. This one, is we've only got part of it here. It does actually extend beyond here, and there is a second line underneath. We're not quite sure exactly what it says, and we would love to know, because it appears to start with the phrase, "For he is not your friend." So we'd like to know the rest of that one. Another example, bottom left here from Ludden. Wonderful example, because we could all see it from the ground. Again, it's quite high up, it's about 3 metres off the ground. And we could all see this amazing inscription, and see it was medieval black letter text, but none of us could read it. And it was only when we actually took photographs, we were all standing around the camera like this, that the person standing opposite says, "Ah, I understand." We turn the camera the other way up, and the inscription is upside down. And it turns out that that particular stone block has a lot of inscriptions on it, and they're all upside down. So they were done when the stone was on the ground, and then when it was rebuilt into the arcade in the late 15th century, they put the stone in upside down. So there to annoy graffiti hunters for generations to come. Other inscriptions, we do get an awful lot of long Latin inscriptions. The temptation, of course, with all text is to be able to read them. Sadly, in most of the inscriptions we come across, that isn't the case. This looks to be a particularly wonderful inscription from Swannington, which actually goes around the corner of the pier. It's a beautiful long inscription. The entire first half of the sentence, though, as you can see, is so badly degraded as to be unreadable. Also, if they are nice, neat if they're a nice, neat Latin inscription, chances are they've also been done by a member of the clergy. If so, they usually contain contractions, abbreviations, and in some cases, they're just very, very bad spelling. So many of these, sadly, we just haven't been able to transcribe. Of all the text inscriptions we get, I suppose only about 20-25% are actually readable. We can pick out individual letters, but to actually make any more sense of it is difficult. Moving on slightly. I'm going to skip that. This is a particularly nice inscription, again text, from Norwich Cathedral. And those of you who are looking closely will also note that this one is upside down again. However, this one, we believe, was actually created upside down. You'll also notice there's this other rather odd symbol at the bottom. Turns out this is an astrological symbol, and it's a symbol for the moon. Now, as an archaeologist, as soon as I saw this, I knew exactly what we had. However, it was about 2,000 years or 1,500 years out of place. This is exactly the same as many of the Roman curses that we come across, where we'll find a name of an individual where it's either been written backwards or upside down or inverted with an astrological symbol. These are widely recognised by archaeologists who've been studying them for generations as curses. They are designed, we've found many examples in London and elsewhere, and these are designed to act as curses for individuals. What's fascinating here is that this one, from the fabric it's on and from the text itself, appears to date from the 15th century. So 1,500 years too late, as it were, or 1,000 years too late. It's also in a part of the cathedral where members of the public would not normally get access. So the chances are this is actually created by a member of the clergy. It's not alone as well. So far we've identified 3 other curses inside Norwich Cathedral. So this is one of a whole series of curses, quite possibly inscribed there by a member of the clergy. This one is directed at the Cainford family. You can just make it out. I think we have, yeah, there we go, turn it upside down. It's, we have K-A-Y-N-F-F-O-R-D. The Cainford family were quite a notable Norwich family, and they actually turned up as correspondents in the Paston letters. So what they've done, what exactly they've done to annoy the individual, we'll never quite know, and whether the curse worked, of course. But this was inscribed very low down in an area where only members of the clergy would pass. Other things we come across, and we'll skip through some of these quite quickly. Faces, a lot of individual faces. A lot of these tend to be almost caricatures, quite grotesque. This particular example from Lyncham always gets a laugh. Not quite sure why. It's actually, it's been suggested this might be a caricature of one of the parish priests. And there is evidence for that. In fact, it's inscribed on a pier directly opposite where the pulpit stood as well. So you almost get the feeling of someone leaning against the pier there in a particularly long, tedious sermon, just inscribing this wonderful caricature on the pier. These particular examples, very fine examples, which were recorded earlier in the 20th century, at Stoke by Clare in Suffolk. There's a whole series of heads all over Stoke by Clare which do have the same caricature effect. Some of them playing musical instruments, some of them appear to be singing. What is clear is they all seem to be by the same hand. So it does appear as though someone is marking a festivity or doing caricatures of the musicians and choir within the church itself. Other things we come across, feet. An awful lot of shoes. The top left image there is actually the font base at Morston up on the North Norfolk coast. And this is one tiny section of the font base where we actually have over 40 inscriptions of shoes dating from the medieval period all the way to the 18th century. And it has been suggested that these are actually inscribed by people who are marking their visit there, so in almost an early form of tourist graffiti. It's also been suggested these may have some sort of other votive element, a bit like the wax hands and feet that were hung up at medieval shrines as sort of ex voto offerings. Unfortunately, we have a lot of these, but they tend to be in very obscure contexts, and we can't find any which are particularly associated with pilgrimage sites. So at the moment, we're sort of sitting with the idea that these are people commemorating their visits to individual sites. We also come across a lot of animals, birds, deer, and people, full-length figures of people. The one on the left from Troston, from the chancel arch, you'll notice that like many of the figures we come across, has actually got hands raised in prayer. So once again, these do appear to be devotional in nature. The other thing we come across in large numbers is heraldic graffiti. Now, for the most part, these are very, very difficult to really sort of make any sense of. Of all the heraldry we've come across, we have yet to be able to identify any single individual family with any of the coats of arms that we come across. And the reason for that is quite simple. Heraldry relies on colour, and it's the one thing we don't have with any of the graffiti. So if we take the rather lovely example from the top right there, which is again from Troston, it looks to be a very clear coat of arms, but without colour being added to that, it could belong to one of about 20 different families, none of whom we could find being associated with Troston. Other interesting bits we come across, but rarely, music. Music, we've come across music scores and chants in 3 or 4 locations. In particular, Norwich Cathedral has a very fine collection. And as you see, this, we've been told by the music historians, this is pre-1560, as far as the music is concerned, and probably represents a chant. So whether it's someone working out an idea on the wall, as the Masons were, and just using it as a drawing board, as it were, a musical drawing board, we'll never know. What is interesting is the cathedral organist at Norwich Cathedral has promised to play it for us. Other bits and pieces, the more unusual we come across a lot of demons. We come across a lot of devils. We come across a lot of very, very unusual depictions of Christian allegorical symbols. The one on the left in particular is now turned up in two places, and it's a representation of the Paradoxian tree, which we don't have time to go into today, but it's a very rare allegory for the medieval church, which only turns up normally in a couple of medieval bestiaries and medieval manuscripts. So to find it on the wall really is quite a coup. We also come across and record any merchants' marks and masons' marks that we find in Norfolk churches. This is particularly enlightening as it's starting to give us an indication of where medieval masons were working. We're starting to see patterns of work emerge amongst groups of masons. So, for instance, we know the masons working in Lincoln Church in 1412. We know that of those three there, two went on to work at Whiten Church in about 1415. So we are starting to see patterns emerge. Now, lastly, we come on to my favourite, I'm afraid. Ship graffiti. We find an awful lot of ships. Now, they can take the form of this rather wonderful fat-bellied merchant ship from Norwich Cathedral, all the way through to this somewhat earlier, rather beautiful example from Parish over the border into Suffolk, which appears to be a very, very early example where you actually got the forecastle and the stern actually being artificially built up. So this appears to be quite an early depiction here. All the way through to a rather beautiful and identifiable North Sea cog from Clyde next to the sea, to this fantastic example, which appeared a couple of weeks ago from the Lincolnshire survey, which appears to show a very late 15th century or early 16th century fighting vessel. Quite similar, in fact, to depictions of things such as the Mary Rose. Now, ship graffiti, we find a lot near the coast. Obviously, you'd kind of expect that. However, we also find it inland. The more we look, the more we're finding it inland. It was recently brought to my attention with a couple of examples from the middle of Leicestershire. You can't get much further from the sea and still be in England. So this idea that these are a coastal phenomenon does appear to be slightly going out of the window. What we can say, though, is we are finding far more examples of ship graffiti by the coast than we are inland. Now, these aren't, or don't appear to just be people drawing pretty pictures of ships. They do appear to actually have a ritual and a function associated with them. And the one example I will give here is Blakeney, up on the North Norfolk coast. At Blakeney, we have a church full of medieval graffiti. Absolutely full. 200 or 300 inscriptions just in the one church alone. Now, that graffiti is located all over the church. However, all the ship graffiti is located on one side of the church. It's on the south aisle. And if you look at the first pier on the south aisle, at the west end, you've got about 3 or 4 ships. The next one's got 6 or 7. The next one has 13. Finally, the last pier on the south aisle has, well, we're not quite sure because there's so many on there, between 40 and 50 individual inscriptions of ships, all around this pier. None of those ships overlap each other. They all respect the space of those around them. Therefore, where you've got a big ship here and a big ship here, a little one will be placed right in between them. They don't overlap. According to the maritime historians, these depictions of ships were created over a period of about 200 to 300 years. So they were built up over a period of time. And obviously, as they were respecting the space of those around them, they were visible to those other people entering that church over that 200 to 300 year period. Interestingly, that one pier is opposite the side altar and a now empty image niche. The church dedication and the dedication to that side altar was St. Nicholas. And for those of you who don't know, as well as his association with children, during the Middle Ages, St. Nicholas was patron saint of those in peril upon the sea. So what we believe we have here is some sort of votive imagery. These are actually votive ships carved into the piers of the church itself. Whether they're thanksgiving for a voyage safely undertaken, or whether they're a prayer for a safe voyage yet to come, We really don't know. What has been noted is quite a few of the ships are shown as damaged, and it may well be that these are actually representing ships that never made it back. Now, lastly, and I know we're overrunning slightly, changing our perception. We talked about medieval graffiti not being like modern graffiti. Why, though, is medieval graffiti changing the way we look at our churches? Well, it's very simple. As I said at the start, many of these images today are really quite difficult to see. Without specialist lighting conditions and without digital enhancement, you really wouldn't be able to see many of these. But that really wasn't the case during the Middle Ages. If we take this other rather wonderful example of ship graffiti from Riverton, up in North Norfolk, we know that when this was first inscribed into that pier, in this case the Chancel Arch, that actually those piers and those pillars were painted. Like every other part of just about every medieval church in England, most surfaces would have been covered in pigment. You would have had your wall paintings of saints all the way along the top. You would have had people being cast down into hell above the chancel arch. But even the lower areas of the church, and the piers in particular, were often painted with a plain colour wash. Now, in the case of Blakeney, we know that that colour wash was a deep red, because we still have fragments of pigment actually sitting on the walls itself. So our ship, when it was first carved into those piers, would have been carved through that pigment to reveal the pale stone beneath. So far from being hard to see, far from being something that's hidden away in dark corners, these little ships would have been highly visible. In fact, in the case of Blakeney, as you walked in, that pier, covered in little white ships, would have been one of the most obvious things you saw within the church. All of these are devotional in nature. So this is really changing the way we think about the inside of a medieval church. It's changing the way we think of how people interacted with the medieval church. Lastly, we couldn't have a talk on graffiti without at least one Banksy in there. So apologies, Banksy. If graffiti changed anything, it would be illegal. Well, medieval graffiti is changing something. As I said, it's changing the way we think about the space within a medieval parish church. It's changing the way we think about how people interacted with that church as a building and as an institution. It really is changing how we view the medieval church from being a static place full of monuments to being an interactive drawing board of lay piety and devotion. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Matt, very much indeed for not only extraordinarily well illustrated lecture, and I love that sort of coup de théâtre at the end, but also for a very thought-provoking talk. I'm sure it may well have raised a number of questions. Would anybody like to throw something at Matt? Verbally, of course.
Would you guess that all of the engravings received official sanction and tolerated by the authorities, or was some the work of people sneaking in after dark and maybe even being punished for it?
Very, very good question. What I would say to that is, I'll give you the example of Blakeney again, where we have this one pier covered in ship graffiti. Now, those examples of ship graffiti were on show for 200 to 300 years. We know this because the designs changed and they still respect the space. Later ones respect the space of the earlier ones, indicating they were still there. At any point in that 200 to 300 years, the vicar, rector, or church wardens could have obliterated them, but they don't appear to have done. We also have cases where we know it is actually the vicar creating the graffiti himself. So in the case, one particular church we got up in North Norfolk, where we have the vicar, John Fulsham, and he campaigns, it's in the parish records, to build a porch for the church. And finally the porch is built in 1415, and he inscribes his name on it. And it's almost, finally done it after that time. So I think most of these, I think we have to put aside this idea that graffiti is something that's destructive and antisocial. I think many of these, or most of them, were seen as legitimate. They weren't something that was hidden away in dark corners. You can see they would have been very, very obvious. We also know that writing on churches is really quite common. There's illustration from the Low Country from the 17th century of people actually inscribing their name on churches or just writing messages. We also have a broadsheet ballad advert from the 16th century, which John Peake from the Blakely Society discovered, advertising wax crayons. What it actually says in the advert, really good for writing on churches. We have to assume it's acceptable. I'm not condoning it now, of course.
I mean, when they scratch these symbols on the walls, do they use any sophisticated tools or just something sharp?
Did they use it? Well, something sharp would do it in most cases, but there's a variety of tools being used. In the Middle Ages, just about everyone was carrying a small knife with them a lot of the time as an eating knife, a utensil. So that would be quite a useful tool for doing it. We have experimented with this. We have taken, don't listen, Brian, we have taken large lumps of stone left lying about when they're knocked down at the churches and abbeys in Norfolk at the Reformation, and we have experimented. It's actually relatively easy to do. Some of the complex shifts would take several hours, but if you have a decent pair of compasses, then creating one of your daisy wheels takes 7 minutes. So we've done a lot of experimentation on this. But yeah, the basic tool would be something like an eating knife. But what's really interesting is for things like the compass drawn designs, because they would have to be someone would have to use something like a pair of compasses. Now, what we know, particularly from the excavations that took place in London back in the 80s, is that although eating knives and things like that are really quite common, compasses in the archaeological record are really quite rare. So people would have had to have access to something, a pair of compasses or compass-like, in which to do these compass-drawn designs. It has been suggested that perhaps their pair of compasses was kept in the church itself and rented out to people. We haven't found any record of monies coming in or out to do with that. One other particular theory that I came up quite wackily with recently is that in the case of things like Swannington, where we've got all these compass-drawn designs around a font, then maybe what we're actually seeing is a gender bias in this graffiti, and that these are actually being created by women. If that's the case, then women at the time were carrying an item on them as an everyday object, which could have created these. And they do turn up in the archaeological record, which is the little U-shaped snips or shears. You see them in lots of illustrations. You see them hanging up by fireplaces. You see them women with these shears hanging from their chatelaines. They're literally like a pair of sewing scissors. But because they're a piece of steel and they're in this U shape, they make a very good pair of compasses. And you can do a daisy wheel very, very quickly with a pair of those. And in fact, they're slightly easier to use than compasses because they don't move. So they're actually fairly static. And they're all about the right size as well. So it's something we're looking at, but perhaps we are seeing a gender bias in graffiti as well. The women did it.
I'd like to draw two parallels to what you've been referring to. One of them is quite an exhaustive study of ship graffiti in churches in Malta, which unfortunately the text is in Maltese, which I don't have, so I can't say whether the author presumes them to have been votive after the event or protected before the event. But in the case of the paintings in shrines and votive chapels, the paintings are definitely after the event of a shipwreck or whatever, so they're thank offerings. The other is just to refer to a different sort of thing, but it's interesting for its multiplicity, which is a point you pointed out. In the monastic church of St. Zeno in Verona, there are two chapels, or one is a one-time chapel, I presume, where there are umpteen small fresco paintings of the Madonna. They're not one great scheme of the sort one sees in a number of chapels and in Florence. They're repetitive images clearly put there by different people, all of them Marian devotions. And that reflects the sort of repetition that you've just shown with the churches, or perhaps with other inscriptions and incisions as well. But it's interesting that, using different media, one may be finding the same sort of repetition in other places where one might be thinking of something quite different.
Well, we are seeing that. The problem, of course, there is that most of the pigment in our parish churches is gone.
Yeah,
Saying that
sure.
we have more than most. We haven't come across anything like that. We are seeing the same repetition and symbolism being used in the graffiti, but also being used elsewhere. So what we started to do recently is look at parish chests. And we have a lot of very good parish chests, many parish chests surviving in East Anglia. And we've found that in many cases the same protection symbols, these same Apotropaic symbols, are being used on parish chests to offer a sort of enhancing the spiritual protection, enhancing the physical protection of the chest itself. And the same with the Marian symbolism as well. We are finding areas where we get repetition after repetition of this Marian protection symbols, and all in certain areas as well. The problem we've got at the moment is that we've looked at an awful lot of churches. We all have an awful lot more to go, and we are starting to see certain regional biases, certain area biases, and also we have to face a lot of Victorian restoration. So we have incomplete pictures. So what I usually say to people is, when we finish Norfolk, we haven't got the answers, we'll start Suffolk. But we started Suffolk last month, so we'll carry on with that one. I think we're going to see different patterns emerge, and I think we will start to see a lot more of this emerging as we start to collate the data. At the moment we have over 12,000 images from Norfolk we're still working through, and I'm getting probably about another 400 to 500 images each week at the moment. So it's a lot to work through. As we do so, as it goes on the database, maybe we'll start to see these patterns emerging.
We've got time for one more question. There was one at the back.
How do you date the graffiti that you're looking at? How do you know that it's medieval and not later?
Someone always asks that question. And it's the one you never want them to ask. The answer is simple: we don't. In most cases, we can't tie it down to more than a few centuries. In cases like Binham Priory, where we have the inscriptions on 12th century fabric underneath the remains of part of the 14th century paint scheme, that's really easy. We've got a nice tight chronology for that. In a lot of other cases, all we can say is pre or post Reformation. In the case of Litcham, where you've actually got graffiti inscriptions emerging out from underneath 6 or 7 layers of lime wash, then we can fairly safely say that they are pre-Reformation day. The really annoying thing about graffiti is they don't start using dates until the middle of the 16th century. And it's the same in a lot of documentation, and it's the same, interestingly, on bells, believe it or not, bell casings. They don't start putting a date on something until the middle of the 16th century. By the middle of the 17th century, it becomes the norm to have a date on it. But any earlier than the middle of the 16th century, you don't have a date on things. And part of that, I suppose, is prior to that point, people tend to be dating things by regnal year rather than calendar date. So we have unusual to find an inscription that actually went in the 15th year of the reign of Henry VII. That's going to take up quite a chunk. So dates are less important, as it were. So in most cases, we really can't tie it down to more than a few centuries. We can say, in the case of Litcham, we know that the inscriptions there are between 1412, when the arcade was built and dedicated on St Botolph's Day, and the Reformation, or in Litcham's case, 1546, when the lime wash appears. So we've got quite a tight time frame, but really that's quite unusual. In the case of things like text, we can use the text form itself. So we can actually look at the typeface and we can date it that way. In the case of ships, we can look at the architecture. In the case of the heraldry, arms and armour, we can use those as dating elements. In the case of figures, we can use the costume. But for most of it, and particularly a lot of the ritual and Apotropaic symbols, we simply can't. We can give you a post or a pre-Reformation date, and that is the very best we can do. Sorry.
Thank you very much. It's just gone 2, so I think we should wrap up. I'm sure Matt would answer any more questions subsequently. But on behalf of the Antiquaries and indeed, I think, an extremely appreciative audience, thank you very much indeed for such a comprehensive talk. I think it's not only brought to us an extraordinary range of inscriptions, but it also was remarkable the way in which it quite clearly is beginning to give us an idea into the minds of the medieval community. And talking of community, I think it also needs to be emphasised how much this is a community-based project. This is growing out of people within the local communities in Norfolk and now elsewhere, going into their churches and recording this stuff for themselves.